The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor of the Whitmore ballroom the moment Dominic Rousseau pulled Charlotte Bennet against his chest and said, loud enough for both families to hear, "I choose her. I have always chosen her." 300 guests froze. Somewhere, a gun cocked. Rain hammered the docks of Providence the night everything started, sheets of it turning the warehouse lights into blurred halos over wet concrete. Charlotte Bennet stood just inside the loading bay, arms crossed over her black coat, watching her younger brother Michael pace like a man already dead. "You shouldn't be here," Michael said. "Not for the first time. Neither should you." Charlotte's voice stayed calm, though her pulse hadn't slowed since the phone call an hour ago. "Come now, alone. Bring nothing." Dominic Rousseau didn't make requests. He issued them, the way their late father used to, the way Michael was still learning to. The Bennets and the Rousseaus had carved up the East Coast shipping trade, between them for 3 generations, an uneasy truce built on old blood and older grudges. That truce was currently bleeding out on a pier in Newport, where a Rousseau shipment had gone missing, and a Bennet name had been found stitched into the lining of the crate that stole it. A car door shut somewhere in the dark, unhurried. Then footsteps, the kind that didn't need to hurry because everyone else always did. Dominic Rousseau walked into the warehouse like weather moving through a room. Tall, dark wool coat beaded with rain, jaw set in the particular stillness of a man deciding whether tonight was the night he became a killer again. 2 men flanked him and stayed at the door. He came alone the rest of the way. His eyes found Michael first, contempt controlled. Then they moved to Charlotte, and something in his expression stumbled, just slightly, before it caught itself. "You brought your sister to a business meeting," he said to Michael, though he didn't look away from her. "I invited myself," Charlotte said. A muscle in his jaw shifted. "This doesn't concern you, Miss Bennet. Everything that threatens my family concerns me." She held his gaze. She was always aware, of how she must look to him. Aware of the soft weight of her body inside a coat that didn't quite hide it. Aware of how men like Dominic Rousseau were trained to measure a room and file people into categories of useful or decorative or dangerous. She'd spent years choosing, deliberately, not to shrink from that measuring. "You think my brother stole from you. He didn't. Someone wants us at war, and you're about to hand them exactly what they want." Dominic studied her the way he might study a ledger that didn't balance. "You have proof. I have logic. Proof takes time you're not giving us." For a long moment the only sound was rain on the tin roof and Michael's ragged breathing. Then Dominic said, low, 48 hours. "If I don't have proof, I burn every warehouse your family owns from here to Boston." He turned to leave, then paused, glancing back at Charlotte with an unreadable flicker. "You should go home, Miss Bennet. This world isn't kind to people who care too much." "Neither is yours," she said, "and yet you're still standing in it." He left without answering, but something in the set of his shoulders had changed. 2 days became a war of quiet violence, a torched storage unit in Fall River, a bodyguard found beaten outside a diner on Atwell's Avenue, a message carved into the hood of Michael's car outside St. Anthony's Parish Hall. Charlotte barely slept. She spent the nights at her kitchen table in her Federal Hill apartment, spreading out shipping manifests, insurance records, security footage timestamps, anything that might reveal the third-party moving pieces on the board. She found it at 3 a.m., a name that didn't belong. A Rousseau lieutenant, Frank Delacroix, whose signature appeared on paperwork for a shipment he claimed to know nothing about. Someone inside Dominic's own house was setting the fire and letting the Bennets take the blame. She called the number he'd left with Michael. It rang twice. Bennet. Dominic's voice rough with something between suspicion and exhaustion. "It's not my brother," Charlotte said. "It's Delacroix. I have the paperwork. Meet me somewhere neutral. The Cambridge room at the Hendricks Hotel. 1 hour." Silence stretched long enough that she thought he'd hung up. 1 hour, he said finally. She arrived first, chose the corner table facing the door out of old habit, and ordered tea she didn't touch. When Dominic walked in, he'd changed from the wool coat into a dark suit, and for the first time she saw him without an audience, just a tired man with shadows under his eyes, sitting across from a woman his family had taught him to see as an obstacle. She slid the folder across the table. He read in silence, and she watched his face harden with each page, not at her this time, but at the betrayal underneath the ink. "Delacroix buried his uncle 2 years ago," Dominic said quietly. "I gave the eulogy. I'm sorry." He looked up. "Why did you bring me this instead of using it? You could have let the war happen. Let us destroy each other." Charlotte considered the question honestly, the way she considered most things. Because dead men don't care who's right, and because, she paused, then decided the truth was worth the risk. Innocent people usually pay for wars they didn't start. I've watched it happen before. Something shifted behind his eyes, some old grief she hadn't meant to touch. "My mother," he said, and stomped himself as though surprised he'd started to say it at all. A waiter approached with a slice of chocolate cake Charlotte hadn't ordered. Dominic must have signaled for it while she wasn't looking. She felt her spine straighten out of old reflex, that familiar flinch of being watched while eating, and she pushed the plate half an inch away, folding her hands instead. Dominic noticed. He didn't comment. He simply reached over, cut a small piece with his fork, and ate it himself as though it had been his all along, taking the attention off her plate without a word. It was such a small thing. It undid something in her chest anyway. "Thank you," she said quietly. He understood she wasn't thanking him for the cake. The truce held technically. Dominic dealt with Delacroix in a manner Charlotte chose not to ask about, and the fires stopped. But something else had started, something neither family had planned for. A string of quiet meetings that no longer needed an excuse. Coffee at a diner in Pawtucket where nobody recognized either of them. A walk along the East Bay bike path in the grey hour before dawn, when Dominic could leave his bodyguards behind for 20 minutes and simply be a man walking beside a woman who didn't want anything from him. He learned that she ran a small, non-profit teaching financial literacy to women leaving abusive households, funded quietly through a shell of her family's legitimate business interests, invisible even to Michael. She learned that Dominic visited his grandmother, Rosa, in a nursing home in Cranston every Sunday without fail, and that the old woman was the only person alive who still called him by his childhood nickname, Nico. "She'd like you," Dominic said once, watching Charlotte laugh at something his youngest cousin had said at a family christening she'd been reluctantly invited to. "She always said I'd fall for someone who terrified everyone but her." "I don't terrify anyone," Charlotte said. "You terrify me," he said, and didn't smile when he said it. She didn't know what to do with that, so she looked away, down at the champagne in her hand, at the dress she'd chosen with more care than she wanted to admit. Not because she thought it would make her beautiful by anyone else's math, but because she'd stopped waiting for permission to feel good in her own skin. Still, old habits whispered. She noticed the way a few Russo wives glanced at her sideways, at the space she took up in a room built for smaller women. She noticed, and she stayed anyway. Dominic noticed her noticing. Later, on the terrace, away from the noise, he said, "You keep bracing yourself, like you're waiting for someone to say something cruel. People usually do, eventually. Not tonight." His voice was quiet, certain. "Not while I'm standing here." She wanted to believe him. That was the most dangerous part. The danger, when it came, wore a familiar face. Michael found her in the parking garage after the christening, his expression stripped of its usual bravado. "You're seeing him," he said. "Not a question. I'm talking to him. There's a difference." "There's no difference where the Russos are concerned, Charlotte. You know what Dad would say. Dad's not here." Her voice was steadier than she felt. "And I'm not going to apologize for keeping this family out of a war that would have buried us both." Michael's jaw tightened, some old wound flaring behind his eyes, grief maybe, or fear dressed as anger. "There are things about Dad's death you don't know," he said, then caught himself, the words sharp enough to draw blood before he could take them back. Charlotte went still. "What things, Michael?" He wouldn't look at her. "Forget I said anything." But she wouldn't forget. Somewhere in her father's death, 3 years buried and never fully explained, a truth was waiting, one that would eventually tear both families open. She could feel it now, the way you feel a storm pressure dropping the air before the first thunder. She didn't know yet that the storm had a name. She didn't know it would be the same name written on the paperwork Dominic had once given his own uncle's eulogy for. She only knew, standing alone in that concrete garage with her brother's confession hanging unfinished in the air, that everything she thought she understood about her father's death and the fragile peace she'd risked her heart to protect was about to come undone. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number, 3 words that turned her blood cold. He didn't fall. Charlotte read the text 3 times before her hands finally stopped shaking enough to type a reply. No name, no number she recognized. Just those 3 words, and beneath them, a photograph, grainy, taken from a distance, of a fire escape behind the old Bennett warehouse on Allen's Avenue. The same fire escape her father had supposedly slipped from 3 years ago. A tragic accident the police report had closed within a week. She didn't call Michael. She called Dominic. He'd arrived at her apartment within 20 minutes, no bodyguards, hair still damp from a shower he'd clearly interrupted. He took one look at her face and didn't ask questions first. He simply crossed the room and put his hands on her shoulders, steady, grounding, the way no one had touched her in a very long time. "Show me," he said. She showed him the photograph, watched his expression change from confusion to something colder, more focused. Where did this come from? I don't know. But Michael said something at the christening. He stopped himself before he finished. She sat down heavily at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd found Delacroix's name weeks ago. What if Father didn't fall Dominic? What if someone pushed him? What if that's why Michael's been so desperate to keep the peace and so terrified every time your name comes up? Dominic sat across from her, quiet for a long moment. "There's a name from that period I never told you," he said finally. "My father did business with a man named Gerald Whitmore before Gerald built his shipping empire legitimate enough to host galas the mayor attends. Whitmore wanted the docks, both the Bennett piers and ours. He couldn't have them while a truce existed between our families." Charlotte's stomach turned cold. "You think Whitmore killed my father to break the truce? I think it's possible your father found out something Whitmore couldn't afford to have discovered. And I think," Dominic said, his voice dropping, "that if Michael has known this for 3 years and said nothing, he's been protecting someone. Possibly himself. Possibly you." The word landed like a stone in still water. Charlotte pressed her palms flat against the table, steadying herself against a truth she wasn't ready to hold. "I need to talk to my brother." "Not alone," Dominic said. "Not until we know how far this goes." They found Michael that night at the old family social club on Federal Hill, a place that had hosted 3 generations of Bennett christenings and funerals, its walls lined with photographs of men who'd built an empire out of docks and silence. He was alone at the bar, a half-empty glass of scotch in front of him, and when he saw Dominic walk in behind his sister, his face went the color of ash. "You brought him here." "I brought him because I'm done watching you carry something alone that's eating you alive," Charlotte said. "Tell me about Dad, Michael. Tell me about Gerald Whitmore." Michael's glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the bar top. For a moment he looked like a much younger man, the boy who used to hide behind their father's coat at church. "Whitmore came to Dad 3 years ago," he said, voice cracking. "Told him he wanted the piers. Told him to convince you to marry into his family instead, to end the Russo alliance for good. Dad refused. 2 nights later he was dead, and Whitmore had a man inside our own warehouse crew feeding him everything. I found out a year later. I didn't tell you because—" His voice broke completely. "Because Whitmore said if I ever spoke a word of it, you'd be next. I've been paying him off in shipping favors ever since, just to keep you safe. I thought I was protecting you." Charlotte's eyes filled, grief and fury tangled together. "You let me grieve a lie for 3 years. I let you live," Michael said. "I didn't know what else to do." Dominic's expression had turned to stone. "Whitmore is hosting a gala Friday night. Waterfront Museum. Half the Harbor Commission will be there, along with men from 3 families who think he's a legitimate businessman." He looked at Charlotte, something fierce and protective sharpening in his eyes. "He's about to announce a merger deal that would let him control every pier from Providence to New Bedford. If we move against him publicly, without proof, it starts the exact war your father died trying to prevent." "Then we get proof," Charlotte said. Her voice, for the first time since the text message, had stopped shaking. "I know exactly how." The Waterfront Museum gala glittered under 100 chandeliers, harbor lights glowing gold through the tall windows behind a string quartet playing something quiet and expensive. Gerald Whitmore worked the room like a man who had never once doubted his own charm, shaking hands, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, his silver hair catching the light every time he turned. Charlotte moved through the crowd in a deep emerald gown, chin lifted, aware of every glance that lingered a beat too long on her frame before sliding away. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't feel the old urge to disappear into a corner. Dominic's hand found the small of her back as they crossed the room together, steady, unmistakably present. "You don't have to do this," he murmured near her ear. "Yes, I do." She'd spent 3 days memorizing the layout of Whitmore's private office 1 floor above the gala, 3 days working with an old contact from her non-profit, a former forensic accountant named Diane Kowalski, who owed Charlotte a debt she'd never asked to be repaid. Diane had traced Whitmore's shell companies back through 11 layers of shipping manifests to a single account that funded the man who'd been inside the Bennett warehouse crew the night her father died, while Dominic kept Whitmore anchored in conversation on the museum floor, a masterclass in controlled charm that made Charlotte's chest ache with something like pride. She slipped upstairs with Diane's files already downloaded onto a drive in her clutch, needing only Whitmore's office terminal to plant the final piece. An anonymous tip routed straight to an FBI financial crimes unit that had been circling Whitmore's empire for 2 years without a way in. She was 3 keystrokes from finished when the office door opened behind her. "Miss Bennett," Whitmore's voice silk over steel. Behind him stood a man she recognized from the warehouse crew photograph Michael had shown her, the man who'd fed him information the night her father died. "I did wonder how long it would take you to come looking." Charlotte didn't move from the desk. Her heart slammed against her ribs, but her voice came out steady. "You killed my father." "Your father was a sentimental fool who valued peace over profit." Whitmore stepped closer. "You, I think, are smarter than that, which is why it's such a shame you've wasted yourself falling for a Russo." Downstairs, 3 floors below, Charlotte could hear the string quartet shift into something slower. She thought of Dominic's hand at her back. She thought of the small piece of cake he'd eaten, so she wouldn't have to feel watched. She thought of her father's face in old photographs, laughing at something just out of frame. "I didn't waste anything," she said, and pressed send. Whitmore lunged for the laptop a half-second too late. The file had already gone, routed, time-stamped, unstoppable. His man reached inside his jacket, and Charlotte's blood turned to ice. But before the gun cleared its holster, the office door slammed open and Dominic filled the frame, 2 of his men behind him, having noticed exactly 3 minutes too many had passed. "Touch her," Dominic said, voice low as a blade drawn slow from its sheath, "and it will be the last decision you ever make." What followed happened in the space of a breath. Whitmore's man reaching, Dominic closing the distance faster than a man his size should move, the gun clattering to the floor. Whitmore himself frozen against the window with harbor lights glittering behind him, like a city that had no idea how close it had just come to war. Sirens rose in the distance, faint at first, then unmistakable. The tip had done more than reach an inbox. It had triggered a raid already staged 2 blocks away, waiting on federal confirmation. By the time uniformed agents moved through the gala below, Gerald Whitmore was being led out in handcuffs past 300 stunned guests, his silver hair no longer catching the light so kindly. The Harbor Commission men who'd shaken his hand an hour earlier stepped back from him like he carried something contagious. Dominic found Charlotte still standing by the office window, hands trembling now that the danger had passed, adrenaline draining out of her all at once. He crossed the room and pulled her against his chest without a word, and she let herself be held, let herself feel the solid, steadying thud of his heartbeat instead of the racing panic of her own. "You saved us," he said into her hair. "You saved all of it. My family, yours, everything. I just wanted the truth," she said. "You gave us peace." He drew back enough to look at her, and something in his face had cracked wide open, unguarded in a way she'd never seen. "Charlotte, I have spent my whole life being told love was a weakness men like me couldn't afford. I have watched my father bury people who chose feeling over strategy. And then you walked into a warehouse in the rain and argued with me like you weren't afraid of a single thing I could do to you. And I have not stopped thinking about you since." Downstairs, the quartet had stopped playing entirely, the museum floor a hush of agents and stunned guests. Dominic didn't seem to notice or care. He reached into his jacket and produced a small velvet box, worn at one corner, clearly carried for longer than tonight. "I don't care what my family expects. I don't care what yours does either. I choose you, Charlotte Bennett, not despite anything the world thinks it sees when it looks at you, because of every single thing it's too blind to notice. Marry me." Charlotte stared at him, at the ring catching harbor light, at 3 years of grief and fear and quiet self-doubt suddenly weightless in her chest. Below them, guests had begun to gather at the base of the staircase, drawn by whispers of what had happened upstairs. When Dominic led her down by the hand, he didn't let go, didn't lower his voice, didn't care who from either family stood watching. "I choose her," he said, loud enough to reach every corner of that glittering room. "I have always chosen her." A champagne glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered against the marble floor. Nobody moved to sweep it up. Every eye in the room was on Charlotte Bennett, radiant in emerald, and the mafia boss who had just declared, in front of both families and half the city's most powerful men, that she was the only alliance he'd ever truly wanted. Charlotte and Dominic married that spring at St. Anthony's, Rosa Russo crying happy tears in the front pew, Michael walking his sister down the aisle with the weight of 3 years finally lifted from his shoulders. Their love was never about disappearing to be accepted. It was about being seen completely and chosen anyway. If this story touched your heart, like this video, share it with someone who believes true love sees beyond appearances, and subscribe for more emotional mafia romance stories.